we are funeral service education. We have a fairly robust program on the campus here at ARC. We are one of only 2 programs in California that teach this particular type of career. And so we'll get started. Hopefully this is all going to work really good. I don't know, but we'll give it a try. As far as questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or just, blurt it out if you have a question as we go through stuff. I know this is probably pretty new for most people. You have no idea what we're doing over there. So please feel free to. So Nate, go ahead and take this one.
So I'm sure most of you are familiar with funerals on a general level. But I think a lot of people come from either their own experiences in the funeral home or what they've maybe seen on television and things like that. So what our focus is really sort of giving a realistic view to the students of the different types of funeral services that are out there and what funeral service really means. And everything is couched in the ethos of reverence for the dead. So everything that we teach the students and everything that we talk about when it comes to funeral service comes from that motto, reverence for the dead. So what is a funeral? The focus is on the survivors of the deceased. We do teach the students embalming and preparation of remains, filing for death certificates, all that kind of thing. But ultimately, it's the family and friends left behind that the students will then also learn to counsel and see through what ultimately is, the hardest moment for most people, right? Funerals allow for a sense of closure, community grieving, individual grieving. There is, the students are required to take a class on psychology of death and dying, which touches on different types of grief. And we also have a counseling class that we teach the students as well. And so that goes into the funeral process as well. And what I always tell the students and the way that I look at a funeral is if it's done right, it doesn't just carry someone through the grief process once the funeral ends. But the way I look at it is that if it's done right, it creates a really sturdy foundation for that grief to take place in a healthy way, right? Grief is not inherently unhealthy, but it can be. And so if we do our jobs well and we train the students well to see through what the funeral is for each individual family, as everyone is unique, different religions, different cultures, different circumstances surrounding the death. But if it's done well, then now you've given the survivors a solid foundation to really sort of express, explore, and process their grief when they do experience a loss.
Okay, so there are a lot of careers actually that we're preparing our students for. But we're gonna focus mostly on actually being a funeral director and embalmer. That's the primary thing that we do. But in their careers, they could be just a funeral director. They could be just an embalmer. They could be both. So that's something that we're giving them both sides of this when we teach them. They take what are called the arts, and those are the funeral directing courses, and then they take the sciences, which are all the ones that relate to embalming. When they're completed with our program, they take what's called a national board. So it's good to be licensed in any state in the country, in the US. And then if they're staying in California, they become licensed here in California also, which requires a separate license. And that's our ultimate goal, is to get them licensed here in California, preferably. And so we prepare them for that part. What do embalmers and funeral directors do? Well, I think Nate just touched on that quite a bit. We do prepare the body. There's no doubt about that. That's a big part of what we're doing. But our bigger part is helping the family get through the services, get through the death. and to start to grieve and to basically pick up the pieces and put their life forward again is what we're doing. And part of that is the preparation of the body and providing a funeral service so that they have something to focus on and work from, is the best way that I can put that. In funeral service, there are actually a lot of career paths. Of course, funeral director and embalmer. There are managers, there's crematory operators, there's willed body donation programs that some of our students go to. Some of them go to work for a coroner's office. We have several of them that work around the areas. They could go into forensics too. That's one thing. They do need more schooling for it, but they could go that route also. As far as employment settings, for the most part, it's going to be a funeral home or a cemetery or a crematory that they would be working in. And of course, a coroner's office possibly. And we're going to talk about salaries. I've got a slide on it because I just went back to check the labor market data the other day to update it a little bit because it has changed for us. It used to be, this was a pretty low paying job, honestly, especially considering what you were doing. And the salaries have started to come up quite a bit from what they were. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on in this. Nate?
So the degree at American River is an Associates of Science, and the program itself is one of 58 programs in the United States. Valerie mentioned we're one program in California, well, sort of two. We have a friendly rivalry with the Southern California Mortuary Science program. That's in Cypress in Orange County. So it's just them and just us as far as funeral service education or mortuary science programs go, the one and the same. But all the programs in the country are accredited by the ABFSC, or the American Board of Funeral Service Education. That is our general accrediting body. There are schools in the country that are single institutions for funeral service. And then there's many schools like us who are part of a bigger district and school. So every 7 years, we are up for accreditation. And Valerie and I have just completed all of our written portions and virtual site visits for our most recent accreditation here in 2022. And we will actually be going to Dallas next week to sit in front of the Committee on Accreditation that's part of the ABFSC to rubber stamp us for another 7 years. So it's a big undertaking since it does, occurs every 7 years. There's other programs that are accredited, 3, 4, 5. But we feel pretty good about it. And once we have our accreditation, it'll be another 7 years of compiling data and then go through all over again. So.
Okay, so there's some interesting stuff about licensing in California. We are a very unique state in that you don't have to be a duly licensed funeral director and embalmer here. You can be one or the other if that's what you want to do. And we have a very, very unique problem here with funeral directors. In California, you don't have to go through a funeral service education program or a mortuary science program to be a funeral director. Anybody with 60 units, any 60 college units can actually apply to take the exam to be a funeral director. So it leaves it kind of wide open for whether you've had any training in this or not to become a funeral director. Fortunately, most funeral directors do actually go through some type of program. And almost all of our students will take a funeral director exam too, just to have the license, whether they use it or not. As far as to become an embalmer, this one's a little bit different. You have to take the national board exam and pass it, of course. You have to have the AS in funeral service from an accredited school. You have to take the state board exam also, and then you have to do a 2-year apprenticeship on top of it all. So it is roughly a 4 to 5 year process to actually become a licensed embalmer in this state. It's pretty long, really. But most of them will go through it and do it.
So some careers in funeral service, Valerie touched on some of them already. But there's definitely jobs available. And, you know, one of the sort of jokes is that you'll always have a job, right? Because we're essentially will always be needed, right? So yes, funeral director is one job. Embalmer is another. You could be a manager. You could be a crematory operator. You might be all 4 of those things. I've worked in positions where I've run the crematory, I've done embalmings, and I'm working with families and working services. You wear a lot of different hats essentially in the funeral home, regardless of what your title may be. Obviously, you could be an owner and operator of your own funeral home, crematory, or cemetery, right? We failed to mention that too, right? You could work in the cemetery side of things, which is, depending on how a funeral home is set up, it may just be a standalone funeral home that employs embalmers, funeral directors, or it could be a combo funeral home that is attached to a cemetery. So now you have sort of a division of service, funeral service, and cemetery service. And so those options are there for you, for students as well. And then of course, instructor. I actually went through the program at American River College and graduated in 2014 and had been working in the funeral home since 2012, and then became an adjunct professor in the program. And now I've been full-time here teaching with Valerie since 2018. And I can say the interest from some of the other students who have graduated from the program in recent years to also be instructors and things like that is very high. And the fact of the matter is, most of the instructors, or pretty much all of the instructors in those 58 accredited programs across the United States, none of them had teaching experience. They all worked in the funeral home and then moved over to the instructor side of things. It's kind of a backwards track to end up in education, but that's sort of one of the many wrinkles in funeral service and learning the craft and the profession. So also, yeah, Valerie mentioned coroner's offices, forensics, all those kinds of things, pathological assistance. There's funeral programs in the country that sort of work in tandem with pathological investigative degrees and things like that also.
So like I was mentioning before, this program, it's multidisciplinary in many ways. We have the sciences, which include embalming, restorative art for the bodies to restore them to their natural lifelike appearance. Pathology, you have to have a good background in it so that you know what you're dealing with, because bodies often come to us and they've died of some disease. And we need to know more about that, how it affects the body, the way the body looks, how it could affect us, possibly. You know, what possible contamination could we get? We need to know anatomy. You have to be able to find things in the body very easily. And that's one of the tough courses for our students sometimes, because it's so intense. And I don't think they realize that they're going to have to do that. And so it's good. We also have the internship. In the last semester of our program, the students spend 16 weeks in a funeral home working as though they were working a normal job there. They do everything from embalming to funeral directing to arrangements, transferring the deceased from the place of death. And also during that time, they take a test every week that prepares them for the national boards. Because after 2 years, they've forgotten a lot of the stuff. So we have to kind of start getting them ready again to do that. As far as the arts side of this, again, that's the funeral directing side more. So it would be funeral directing itself, counseling, merchandising, because they do need to have a good background in the merchandise that they're selling, because people do ask questions. They want to know a lot about what they're spending their money on, which is understandable. We teach them the history of funeral service, because I think to have a good background in this, to understand why we do it and how we came to do it, is important. Management, our students currently are in their management class right now. And it's because most people are going to want to probably move into management at some point in their career. It's the better paying job. It's has a lot more responsibility, but they need to understand how a funeral home works, how it runs, and what kinds of things you're going to be doing as a manager. Law, which is extremely important. The law side of the arts touches everything that we do in the funeral homes, absolutely everything. And I don't know, maybe some people realize this and some don't, but the only time you hear about a funeral home or funeral service really is when it's in the news, because somebody has broken a law of some kind. And so we try to really hammer home how important it is to understand and know the laws and the ethical parts of this. So ethics is a part of our law course also. And communication. Funeral directors typically are in the background at a funeral, but they spend a lot of time with families and they need to be able to communicate. You can't find out what a family wants for a funeral if you can't talk to them and you can't communicate back and forth with them, because when people come in to make arrangements, they're typically not at their best that day and during the funeral service. So the communication is important. You're learning, body language, things like that. All of it that goes together. So we spend a lot of time on all of these different things, and a lot of our courses interweave different things like this. Psychology is a big one in there too, that goes in with the counseling. But we don't actually teach our psychology course. So.
All right, so what do embalmers and funeral directors do? Well, a funeral director is a licensed professional that specializes in all aspects associated with funeral service. So we have a small list here, but like I said, you wear a lot of different hats, and each day you're going to be doing something different. Okay, so the first thing is provide support to the bereaved during the initial stages of grief. Families reach out to us many times not knowing at all what to do, right? The fact of the matter is, America at this point in 2022, we weren't before, but we became a death denying culture. And what that has done is sort of created added to the shock when a death does occur, and the magnitude of the loss, I think. So it's our job to provide support for those families when they initially experience that loss, but also through every stage of that, if possible. We will arrange and direct funeral ceremonies. And again, those are going to be unique to the different families and what they want to have for their loved one. We'll arrange for the removal of the deceased from the place of death. That could be from the home, that could be from the hospital, or usually the coroner's office. Well, not usually, it'll be the home, the coroner's office, the hospital, or potentially maybe an assisted care living facility. Those are generally the places where we will be transferring a deceased from into our care to the funeral home. We'll prepare and arrange the preparation of the body according to the wishes of the survivors and the requirements of California federal law. That will be, preparation could be embalming, dressing, casketing for a full viewing. Preparation could simply be a sort of a minimal preparation for a short, small, intimate family viewing. They could be preparation for cremation, or it could be preparation for burial without any viewings attached to it at all. So there's a lot of different areas of the preparation, some for viewing, some not. We'll secure information for legal documents, i.e. A disposition permit, in order for a deceased to be cremated, transferred out of state, buried in a cemetery. You have to have a permit filed. So we'll prepare all of that for the family. Also, we'll prepare the death certificates. In California, you prepare the permit directly through the funeral home. The death certificate is done at the county health office in the county that the death occurred. So we get all the information from the family, we get information from the doctors or the coroner. We compile all of that for those two documents so that the family can follow through with their funeral, and then have the legal document of the death certificate. We'll assist survivors with details for filing claims for death benefits. There's Social Security death benefits. If there's a life insurance policy, we can assist with that. Sometimes families have prearranged things for funeral services, and we'll help convert those as well. And then help to individuals adapt to the changes in their lives following a death, right? You have that loss, everything is disrupted. Life, there's a time, there's a life before the death, and there's a life after the death. And making that transition for people can be extremely difficult. And that's a big part of what we do as well. Whether, like I said, starting to sort of build that foundation for them so that they can move forward on solid footing. But we also some funeral homes will offer aftercare programs. So staying in touch with families after the funeral has occurred, touching base with them 6 months later, a year later, or even having grief counseling sessions and things like that provided by the funeral home. You want me to keep going, Valerie?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So what do embalmers do? So that was sort of the funeral directing side, really. The embalmers are going to be the ones that, and again, you could be both. You could be duly licensed. So you could be embalming one day, funeral directing the next day, or embalming in the morning and then funeral directing that afternoon, vice versa, all kinds of things like that. But what embalmers do is essentially prepare the body to delay any adverse decomposition or effects from decomposition so that a viewing can take place at a later time. So embalming is preservation, disinfection, and presentation of the remains. So preservation is done by essentially, the shorthand is essentially replacing blood and other bodily fluids with preservative chemicals. And what this will do is it will delay decomposition, not indefinitely, but for enough time so that the family can then plan accordingly for their viewing. So, there could be, families are spread out now, right? So I'm sure some of you have family members that are out of state. So sometimes it takes time for people to all come together for the funeral services. So someone could die and you may want to have a funeral service 2 days from now. You may want to have a funeral service 2 weeks from now. And what COVID did was push things 2 months out because of the sheer volume of deaths that were occurring on top of the normal deaths due to COVID. Services were getting pushed out farther and farther and farther. So if somebody wanted to have a viewing for their loved one, but they couldn't schedule a service for 2 months, what embalming will do is delay the body from decomposing into a state that would not be suitable for viewing. And the disinfection part just sort of makes the body safe to be around, depending on the pathological issues or contagions that were inherent due to some types of death. And then lastly, the presentation is where we as embalmers put on our artist caps, and we're restorative artists, where we will do hair, makeup, dress the deceased. Basically what we're attempting to do there is make the deceased look as natural as possible. Okay. So that is an entire class that we teach the students as well. We teach embalming, and concurrently we teach restorative art. And restorative art gets into all kinds of things like recreating features with wax if you have to, fixing discolorations or bruising, or if someone has died in a traumatic accident, fixing trauma to the body so that it's a suitable natural appearance again. And then again, makeup, hair, that kind of thing too.
Okay, now salaries. This is what I was talking about a little bit earlier. There have been some changes over the last several years. Now, I will say that funeral directors and embalmers, considering what we do, are still probably pretty underpaid compared to other jobs, especially when you consider the time it takes to be licensed. But right now, this is in California, at least Northern California. Funeral directors are making about $25.76 an hour. Their annual wage around $53,000. Embalmers don't make a lot more. They make 26 with 55 for their annual wage. Now, if you happen to be both of those licensed dually, you'll probably make more. This is just one or the other right now. But it's very hard to find accurate data on combined ones. They don't provide a lot of that. Now, funeral home managers, though. Now you can see the big jump up, $41 an hour. That's pretty good money. That's not bad at all. $86,000. Of course, you have a lot of responsibility, but you know, when you're doing this, at least they're getting paid well in management. So that was nice to see the big jump up in it. Funeral professional hours. This is the part that gets most people, that will get them out of the business quicker than anything, is we are basically 24/7. People do not pass away between 8 and 5, just strictly. They pass away at all hours, on holidays. And so we have to be ready to go at any time. So a funeral home is essentially open 24 hours a day to take a call from a family, and we will certainly talk with them. We will send someone out to bring the deceased into our care at the funeral home. So, you know, we are on call. And that's one of the things that is very hard for a lot of people to do, is you lose 24 hours of your life every few days when you're on call like that. If you work in a smaller funeral home, you're on call all the time. And so, yeah, that can be a little rough on people. So lifespan with the funeral industry, and this is where we get into problems, is that typically after about 5 to 7 years, people, they get burned out on this, being on call 24 hours a day, and with the emotion that we deal with families, it can be very hard on people, because you're taking, you know, you're trying to do your job and be a professional, but people are grieving there, and it's hard on funeral directors to do this. You know, they see children passing away, and that gets everybody. So a lot of times after about 7 years, they leave the industry and go on to something else. I would say probably, I don't know, maybe, what do you think, Nick? 50% of our students will stay in it after that time period and go on to have a long career in funeral service. But we did see a very large amount of people leave the industry during COVID, because it was so overwhelming for them. It was kind of like how the medical professionals had such a problem with it, because just the sheer volume of people coming through was just more than they could take. So, oops, hold on. Okay.
Yeah, we've gone through this already, right? If you could start at the funeral home, and maybe you are getting burned out, or you don't like necessarily being on call, missing holidays and things like that. Well, here's some other avenues for you, right? Coroner's assistant, the willed body program coordinator, I like for donor services, or UC Davis anatomical donation. Those are two separate things. Management, pathologist or forensic pathologist, instructor, professor, expert witness, or crematory operator. Okay.
So your employment settings, like we said, the funeral home, of course, or mortuary, it's known by both names. The county or hospital morgues. Every hospital has a morgue for the most part, and somebody has to work within those. So, getting bodies ready to go out to the funeral homes. You could work at the coroner's office again, and there are a lot of different jobs within the coroner's office to do. You could be a deputy coroner. You could be a pathology assistant. You could be a pathologist if you went to medical school too. You could be the person working with the indigent program, or you could be the person that handles having death certificates taken care of for the coroner's office. Clerk. There's a lot of different areas there that they encompass. And then the crematory, of course. During COVID, we saw an increase in cremation, mostly because there were times when people couldn't have funerals. And it kind of at the beginning of COVID, people weren't really sure how safe it was to have a body at a funeral. So cremation took off during that time, even more so than it has. So crematories are very common to see. We have several very large crematories around Sacramento and in the Bay Area also. And the one thing we're missing out there, of course, is a cemetery. You could be working in a cemetery, not usually as an embalmer, but in some ways at a cemetery, a funeral director is also applicable. Because they run the services out in the cemetery at the gravesite.
So we had a question in the chat. Beyond the internship, does ARC assist with job placement resources throughout the industry? The funeral homes in the area, and especially extended to the Bay Area and the Central Valley, south of Stockton even, they use us as their pipeline for jobs. Valerie and I are constantly getting emails and calls from the funeral homes in the area saying, hey, do you have any students you can send my way? So the internship does really help the students get the on-the-job training that they may not have right now in the classroom. There's only sort of so much we can do in the classroom to prepare them. The internship really gets their foot in the door, and a lot of them will land a job at the funeral home that they serve their internship at. But yeah, constantly there's job openings up, and we're referring students to funeral homes while they're in the program and even after they graduate. So that's sort of the majority of what we're doing beyond the internship is the funeral homes are really using us more than we're trying to sort of ask them for help.
As an overview of our program, we have two different tracks, and this has only been about the last, I think, 6 years now that we've been doing this. We have a 1-year program and a 2-year program. Now, before, the majority of the students would take the 2-year program because they do about 3 or 4 classes a semester, which is manageable. And they go 2 days a week, actually 2 afternoons. Our classes are all taught in the afternoon, evening time, because so many of our students work and they may be working in funeral homes or in other jobs. And so we try and make it as easy as possible for them to be able to work their day and then come in and do their classes later. So what the differences are in these two programs is the 1-year track, the students have to have all of their general education completed before they come into the program. And then all they do is take our core classes. And on top of that, they take 2 semesters at a time in it. So they're going to school 4 days a week with us. They take the first and third semester together and the second and fourth together. So they're pretty high on those units when they're doing this. But for a lot of them, they may be working at a funeral home who would like to make them an embalmer quickly or a funeral director quickly. And so they encourage them, go do the program faster than the 2 years. And so that way they can get back into their full-time work at the funeral home. And as I said, a lot of these are students who are already working in funeral homes doing this. The 2-year, the only thing that they need to do is they have to complete our introduction to funeral service course and the anatomy course before they come into our program. They can take all of their general ed while they're actually in the program. It's spread out over 2 years. And so it gives them a lot more flexibility if that's what they need. They also take a course every summer, just so you know that. So our program is running year round. It doesn't take a break for the summer. And it starts in the spring and ends at the end of December. So they might start, like the ones that just started this spring, will graduate in December of 2023. If they're on the 1-year track, they'll be graduating in December 2022. And that's kind of, it gives you an idea. The 1 year, they go Monday through Thursday. I don't know why we have TR, it should be TH, but anyway. So they go Monday through Thursday and take at least 2 to 3 classes each day. The 2-year track, they start out going to school on Tuesdays and Thursdays and then switch to Monday, Wednesdays in their 2nd year. So they have a little bit of break up there on which days and everything.
There was another question in the chat about few alumni from the ARC Funeral Service Program said there is an increase in interest in Aquamation. Do you see it as a growing trend in the area? What Aquamation is essentially water cremation. So Aquamation, alkaline hydrolysis are synonymous, and it's cremation with water instead of fire. And that just became legal in California recently. So the opportunities for that are not big right now. But yes, I do see an increase in that coming down the line. Absolutely. As I think sort of some of maybe the technology gets a little bit more affordable for places to set up shop with that, we'll definitely see an increase in that. Will water cremation overtake traditional cremation with heat? I'm not sure. It's hard to say. I don't see that happening quickly, as cremation itself has taken such a long time to sort of gain popularity. But there is definitely an interest in that, and mainly for environmental reasons, I think, using water cremation as opposed to heat. So, Wendy, does that answer your question? I hope so.
Do you want to do the internship?
Yeah. So the internship course, this is again sort of their capstone course that they will take in their final semester. It's a 5-unit course. It's very intensive. And this is where they will have to serve essentially 216 hours during their final semester at a funeral home, doing various tasks. The funeral home will have them do all sorts of things, but what they are required to complete in order to finish the internship course, and these are guidelines from our accrediting board, the ABFSC. So the students must complete 10 embalmings, and a caveat to that is they can complete some of those embalmings with Valerie or I at different points throughout their time in the program. It doesn't necessarily have to be during that internship timeframe, but they have to have 10 completed by the end of the time frame. They have to observe 5 funeral services So going on church services or memorial services or services at the chapel with funeral directors at their site. They have to take 5 first calls. And you might say, what's a first call? A first call is the very initial contact when someone calls the funeral home to tell us that someone has died. So that's the first call. That's our first point of contact. Could be with the family, it could be with the hospital, it could be with a hospice nurse, it just depends. But that's what a first call is. So the students have to take 5 of those calls. And when you're on those calls, you're getting details: who, what, why, when, where, circumstances surrounding the death. You have to do that in order to then take the next steps accordingly. So the students will take 5 of those. I can tell you from my own experience, it was very nerve-wracking to take those calls when you don't have any experience. So these can actually be mock first calls. Sometimes they have to be. Sometimes the funeral home will say, we'll train them very quickly to take the calls. Other times they'll say, okay, we'll do some mock first calls, right? They have to observe 5 funeral arrangements. The 5 funeral arrangements would be the arrangement setting where funeral director sits down with the family and goes over all the details so that they can file the permits and death certificates that I mentioned, but also arrange all of the details. And now you're an event planner. So you're arranging all the details for whatever type of service the family wishes to have. Are you going to have services at the funeral home in the chapel? Are you going to just have a burial without any family present at the cemetery? Are you going to go to a church across town and have a vehicle procession back to the cemetery after the church? All those details will get worked out in the funeral arrangement. And we'll talk about that if we have time in a little bit more detail, but that's the one thing that's really hard for us to teach the students realistically, because we do mock funeral arrangements with the students, but it's not until you sit across from somebody who just lost their husband or their spouse or their child that you don't really get it. You have to do it. So there is a lot of on-the-job training, and this internship class really helps with that. They have to make 5 transfers. That is essentially moving the body from one location to the next. So maybe they go on a call to a house to pick up someone and bring them back into their care. Maybe they go to the hospital, or maybe it's simply moving somebody from the funeral home to the crematory. And then, like Valerie said, they will be taking a test. They take a test each week that covers all of the subjects that they've taken throughout their time in the program. So they take a comprehensive test each week of 100 questions, preparing them for the national boards that they'll need to take once they graduate. And if we have some time, we do have a video we'll try to show you at the end of the new CTE building, which we will be part of, where we will have a working mortuary on campus, where we will be able to do all of these things right on campus at ARC, including making the arrangements. We'll talk about our partnership with the Sacramento County Coroner here. We have an agreement with the Sacramento County Coroner where if they have a deceased who is indigent, and that the coroner has a process to vet out the individual and determine them indigent. That could mean that there's no family at all. That could mean that the family just doesn't want to have anything to do with the deceased. It could mean that they financially can't really afford to do anything with the deceased. The Sacramento County Coroner will then say, okay, Valerie, we have a case who is deemed indigent, and the family at that time, if there is family, has an option of using our program so that we can embalm with the students and then provide a short visitation funeral service for those families at no cost. And so it's a huge, huge collaboration that Valerie was able to secure in making this happen. One, it gives the students immediate embalming experience their first semester. You can imagine that maybe there's some students that are really into this, and then they step into a prep room and see a dead body for the first time and they faint, or they just can't handle it. And so this allows them to figure that out sooner rather than later, which is great, but also just giving them that experience. And then for the community service aspect of it, offering the families this small free funeral service is wonderful. And they're just over the moon happy when we're able to provide that for them. And so it really benefits our program, it benefits the students, and it benefits the community greatly.
Okay, so this kind of builds on what Nate was just talking about, our partners in the community. One of our largest partners is obviously the Sacramento County Coroner's Office. They have a very large indigent program in Sacramento County, and probably most people are not aware of it, that somewhere between 500 and 700 people a year are considered indigent and can't afford any kind of service, or maybe just don't have family. So we work with them, and we try to take anywhere between 30 to 60 different families a year to work with us. And it depends on how much time we have in a semester. We may do more sometimes and sometimes not. When we have the new working mortuary, we anticipate we'll be able to do many more, because we'll be right there with it all the time. Our other partners are the funeral homes. Absolutely, the funeral homes. We depend on their generosity in taking our students in and teaching them for the hands-on sections of this, other than what we can do. And they give them the real world experience. And they're seeing, the students are seeing what happens every single day. The majority of funeral homes have somebody on our advisory committee also to let us know how we're doing, let us know how our students are doing, and let us know what's changing in the funeral service. Neither Nate or I are working actively at funeral homes anymore. So, there might be new trends coming out, and we don't know about them necessarily. So they give us a lot of information there. And of course, they have a direct pipeline to the newest employees coming out of our program, because they get to see them firsthand. Other partners are crematories. As I mentioned, there are several large crematories in the Sacramento area. There's a lot of smaller ones too, but we partner with the crematories as far as our indigent cases that we handle. After we've completed the embalming and the services, we have the cremation done for the family, and we return the cremated remains back to the family. And this was a really key point, because what was happening for a very long time, if a family was deemed indigent, the cremation was done by the coroner's office, but they didn't return the cremated remains back to the families. So although the families may not have wanted to have anything to do with it, or couldn't afford to have anything to do with the deceased, they didn't have a chance after that. It was done and over with. So that's something that we brought into play, is to be able to return the cremated remains back to the family. And we really do serve the community. This has been huge for our community, to be able to have funeral services. They can see more of what's going on with our program. And it's given a lot of people an opportunity to have a viewing or a service that otherwise could not have, because the coroner's does not provide any kind of funeral service. That's us doing it. And so I think that was a big thing. And for our students, this has been huge, to be able to work with these families on arrangements, or at the viewings, or at the services, or during the embalming. They're getting to see what it's really like. And when we do have our chapel, we'll be doing that as a full-time thing going on over there. So
Valerie, if you want to stop the share, I can get the fly through.
oh, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, let me stop that for a minute.
So we do have a mocked up fly through video of the future American River Chapel that is going to be built on campus. And I will go ahead and share that with all of you here. Can you see it?
There it is.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can see it.
All right. There's no sound, but this is essentially the mock-up of the new building. So this would be our actual chapel on site. And then we'll have a restorative art lab connected to an actual embalming prep room. And a general reception area with offices for faculty. And I don't know if it goes in there or not, but we will have a selection. It does.
It does not go inside the
Okay.
arrangement offices.
So yeah, so then we'll have arrangement offices where we can meet with families, with the students. And we will also have a selection room where we would have some casket cuts and urns and things like that on display. So, and then this faces Myrtle.
Mhm.
And that faces out to Myrtle. So,
And we'll have an area basically where our students, let me go back to that. Our students will be able to come through the building in any manner, but we'll have the families coming in from a separate area. So they don't have to walk across campus. And they'll be able to park when they come in for their services and arrangements and things like that, because we're kind of over back on the corner near the creek. So that was a good thing that we were able to do that. We'll have our own refrigeration in there. We have a hearse, actually. We don't use it right now, but we have one. And you guys might have seen it on campus a few years ago while it was still parked over by our old classroom. Right now, it's just kind of put away, waiting. So as far as the future with this new program, with this new building, it's going to give our students a much broader experience than they've currently had. We will be the only working mortuary like this across the country as far as a school. Now, there are some others that are starting to look at doing this too, because they realize how important this is. I went to school in San Francisco, the San Francisco College of Mortuary Science, which is no longer there. And we had a working mortuary. What it did was it gave us the hands-on experience right away in school. We were constantly doing things. And when we graduated, every one of us had a job because they would come in and recruit us because we had so much experience already. And I think that was very important. And it served the community of San Francisco too. And, you know, we're doing the same thing here with doing this. We're going to serve the Sacramento community, and hopefully we're going to expand out a little bit too. Placer County is interested in partnering with us, and San Joaquin County has expressed an interest in partnering with us. So the more people we can help throughout Northern California, the better, as far as I'm concerned. And we expect that the program will be growing quite a bit because of this. We hopefully will have a hybrid model for our classes because we do get students from all over. We just had 5 students graduate that came from Southern California. And they were lucky they were able to do most of the stuff online because we were online at the time. But we are not normally fully online. We're in the classroom, face to face. And currently we have a student now who's flying up every week to go to classes from Los Angeles. So if we could make a hybrid model, that's going to make this all the better for us. We can really expand out and help a lot more people, help a lot more students get through this at a lower cost than them having to go to a private mortuary school. Hold on. Okay. Let's see, I will stop sharing so I can see everybody and everything. What kind of questions do you guys have? You've got to have some. And you can ask anything. No?
Hi, this is Noelle. I have a question.
Sure.
I was just curious if your services would extend to any time that there's a body exhumed from a grave site. Would you ever have to deal with that, or is that more the cemetery's job?
In our program, we don't deal with it, but in real life, yes, we do. When there's a disinterment, a funeral director needs to be there to make sure that the body is taken out properly, it's intact, that the container, whatever it may be, the casket, that it is intact and safe. And then typically we take the body back to the mortuary, and we may do some different things to get the body prepared to go into a new casket, or maybe to be taken to a coroner's office to be examined, things like that. Does that kind of
Okay.
answer?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Liz said in the chat, are there opportunities for paid internships or work studies for the internship period? It is not a requirement for the funeral homes to pay the students during their internship time, but a lot of them do. A lot of them will actually bring the student on to payroll and pay them during that time. There are a few funeral homes that, do say, well, this is at your benefit, so we don't necessarily aren't going to pay you. But I think all the feedback that I've gotten is, for the most part, the majority of funeral homes where the students are doing their internships, they are getting paid for that, which is great. And then, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name.
Yorka.
Yorka, what may be the price range for a funeral service? It really depends on what type of funeral service you would like to have. If you would like to have the most affordable is a direct cremation, which essentially means that the family would meet with the crematory or the funeral home, and then a few weeks later or 10 days later, they would receive an urn back of cremated remains. So there's no services whatsoever. There's no viewing. The cremation is done on the time frame of the crematory. That's the most affordable option, and that ranges from right around $1,000 to maybe $2,500, depending on where you go. If you want to have a full funeral service, you're probably looking at the range between starting at, I would say, what, Valerie, probably $4,500
Yeah.
for a funeral service, where you would have a casket, a viewing, and an actual service, followed by either a cremation or a burial. One thing to note is, I just kind of touched upon it, the funeral side of things is separate from the cemetery side of things. So when I say $4,500 for the funeral service, that means essentially meeting with the arranger, having your funeral service, but that does not include buying a cemetery plot, opening and closing that cemetery plot, markers and headstones and things like that. So that's an entirely separate expense to the families if you were to have burial at a cemetery. So the price range it varies drastically on what you want. I mean, you could spend as little as around $1,000 for a direct cremation, or you could spend $30,000 when it's all said and done. It really just kind of depends on the types of services that you have
And how elaborate.
Those are.
Yeah. Depending on your casket selection and things like that, caskets vary a great deal. Although you can buy a casket from Costco, just in case you didn't know that. They have them there.
And the one thing that I also is in California, we have something called an advanced healthcare directive, or a durable power of attorney of healthcare. And what that form does is essentially allows you to name the person who will decide what happens to your body after you die. In California, there is a legal next of kin who has the right to disposition for when you pass. And if you fill out an advanced healthcare directive, which is very easily downloaded from the internet and filled out, notarized, or filled out with witnesses, you can designate someone to be in charge of that. It can really streamline things and help to uncomplicate the issues that arise when a death occurs. So if that's something that you're interested in knowing more about, let us know. And then let's see, mention there was a strong relationship with local funeral homes. Is there a similar or growing relationship with the alternate employers, coroner's office, death certificates? Well, I would say it's probably just the coroner's office right now, crematory, and funeral homes. There is an electronic death registry system that the funeral homes use to file permits and to start the process of getting the death certificate. And that's something that I've been trying to work more with them to get students access to that program as just a training module. They used to offer that. They used to offer sort of a training that we could have the students do, but then they did away with that a few years ago. And I've been beating my head against the wall to try to find someone who's can help us with that again. But I think right now it's extended to just the coroner's office and cemetery, crematory, funeral homes. You want to tackle this one, Valerie, from
What
Wendy?
is it? I can't see it.
Oh, can you tell us a little bit more about the counseling preparation that the students go through so that they can best explain the legal and financial aspects of a funeral to a family? As a young adult, I haven't had a lot of involvement in any funeral planning, but I understand that there can be quite a bit of legal paperwork and situations where communication could be tense between families and the various professionals they meet with.
Sure. What we do, I teach the first semester students. And so one of the things that I do is I sit them down after they've been in my class for about 6 weeks. I sit them down with the paperwork that is typically used for an arrangement. And I have them group up and practice just making arrangements, just to break the ice on this so that they feel a little more comfortable. We go through between the funeral directing class that I teach and the law class that Nate teaches, we teach them about the paperwork that's required, mostly because it's important that you understand it, that you've seen it, and you get a handle on it. They do see a lot of it during their internship time also. And then in their last semester, they take a counseling class. And during that counseling class, they're not only doing a lot of reading and discussing, but they're also taking tests on it to understand how it works. And then they have to wrap that up with doing an actual arrangement in front of the whole class and everybody. And we bring in people who are not associated with the class or funeral service necessarily. We do like to have the drama students come over, but we haven't been able to do that this last couple of years. So we've had volunteers that have come in that have no idea about funeral service, and they take the role of the family. We give them a scenario, and those scenarios are usually pretty rough. We try to make them difficult so it makes anything else seem easier. And so we do that and we have them practice. And they're graded on it and they reflect on how they did and how they handled it and what they could do better, and have a peer review from their fellow students about how they did. And I think that's a good way to do it, because a lot of this is every funeral arrangement you make is going to be unique. Sometimes you'll have a run of a full week where every arrangement you make, the families are just the nicest people in the whole wide world. They come in, they don't yell at you, they're not crying, they're prepared, things like that. But then you go on these times when the deaths have been very tragic for whatever reason, and 15 family members come in and they're yelling things at you about why can't this be this way or that way, or how come the costs are so high, things like that. So we spend a lot of time talking about that stuff to the students throughout the whole program, explaining why the costs are what they are. And, you know, the things that you're going to see, hopefully you'll have at least just an inkling of how to handle things. Does that kind of answer the question? Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, the sitting down and making arrangements with somebody is really the hardest thing for us to teach the students. That's probably the biggest learning curve that they just learn on the job when they get into the funeral home. But with the new building, when we're actually going to be able to have the families come who are using the indigent program through the corner, the students can sit down and actually do those arrangements with those families who have experienced a loss. And it is a little bit of a different dynamic because it is a free service for the families that are using the program. And so they're definitely more grateful than doing an arrangement than handing them a $4,500 bill, right? But it's going to vastly prepare the students to sit down and make their first arrangements at the funeral home that much better than what they're getting right now. We can do mock arrangements every day in the counseling class and throw all kinds of scenarios at them, but it's just not the same, right? It's just not the same when an actual death has occurred and you're sitting across from somebody who's grieving that loss. So
And
go ahead.
We do let the students come when we make the arrangements. Either Nate or I do make the arrangements currently with the families. And the reason that we were doing that was because we were going into the families' homes, and I was kind of uncomfortable taking a student not knowing what kind of situation they might be getting into. But what we have done several times, we haven't done it this last couple of years, obviously, but we would have the family come to the campus and we would have the students sit in and observe with us while we did the arrangements. So it gave them a kind of idea of how it flows.
Sandra, does ARC offer grieving classes? The two classes that focus on that the most for the students would be the psychology of death and dying, and then the counseling class. So the counseling class it gives the students a lot of different theories and approaches to grief counseling, but we don't have a specific sort of like grief licensing or grief training specific certificate or anything like that. But they do get exposed to different theories and methods and different types of grief that they might see and how to recognize those. So, and then when's the new building going to be in use? We're hoping to be in there in 2024 or maybe 2025 at this point. I'm not sure. I don't think they've broke ground yet in the area where it's going to be. I think all where our old classes and the auto tech that's going to be all demolished and replaced with the new building, but I don't even think they've started to take everything down yet. So it's going to be at least probably 2 or 3 years.